History is filled with great mysteries, but some are more unsettling than others. They are the stories that end not with a conclusion, but with a question mark. The stories that leave behind an unnerving silence. Imagine a village of over 100 people, a fledgling community on the edge of a vast, unknown continent. They were men, women, and children, the first English families to ever call America home. They were meant to be the beginning of an empire, but they vanished. When their governor returned after a long and desperate delay, he found nothing. No struggle, no bodies, no graves, just empty houses and a silence that screamed louder than any battle cry. All that was left was a single cryptic word carved deep into a wooden post. That word has haunted American history for over 400 years. It is the only clue, the only epitaph for a colony that was swallowed by the wilderness. This is the story of that word and the people it represents. This is the story of America's oldest and most chilling unsolved mystery, the Lost Colony of Roanoke.
To understand the story of Roanoke, we cannot begin on the shores of the New World, littered with shells and smelling of salt. We cannot even begin on the creaking deck of an English ship, with its sails full of wind and promise. No, to find the real beginning, we must travel back to the heart of the old world, to an island nation brimming with ambition, poetry, and fear. We must begin in Elizabethan England. In the late 16th century, England was a nation caught between a glorious past and an uncertain future. It was an age of Shakespeare, of soaring new ideas and brilliant art, but it was also an age of deep-seated anxiety. The nation's queen, Elizabeth I, was a formidable monarch, a woman of sharp intellect and iron will, who had held her kingdom together through decades of turmoil. But her throne, and indeed her entire nation, existed under a vast and imposing shadow. That shadow was cast by Spain. While England was a small, often damp island on the edge of Europe, Spain was a global superpower, the first empire on which the sun truly never set. Its galleons, like floating treasure chests, plied the oceans, heavy with gold and silver, plundered from the Aztec and Inca empires. Spanish power, fueled by the riches of the Americas, was overwhelming. Their armies were the most feared in Europe, and their Catholic faith was a direct challenge to Elizabeth's Protestant England. To be English in this era was to feel cornered, to look out at the sea and see not opportunity, but the domain of a powerful rival. Spain's king, Philip II, was not just a competitor. He saw himself as the sword of the Catholic Church, and viewed Elizabeth as a heretic and a usurper. This rivalry created a kind of national claustrophobia in England. The court in London was a glittering world of intrigue and elegance. But beyond the palace walls, there was a palpable hunger. A hunger for wealth to rival Spain's. A hunger for land to expand England's influence. A hunger for a new stage upon which the English people could prove their worth. Not just as poets and playwrights, but as pioneers and masters of their own destiny. They looked at the maps, at the vast empty spaces across the Atlantic that the Spanish had not yet claimed, and they saw a canvas, a place to build a new England, a Protestant fortress, a source of unimaginable riches, and a dagger to hold at the throat of Spanish shipping lanes. The New World was more than just land. It was an idea, a grand and dangerous solution to England's problems. It was an escape, and it was a challenge. And for a challenge of that magnitude, England needed a champion. And a champion did emerge. His name was Sir Walter Raleigh, a man who seemed to be cast in the very mold of the era itself. He was handsome, dashing, and possessed a mind as sharp as his rapier. He was a poet whose verses could capture the heart of a queen, a soldier who had fought brutally in Ireland, and a sea captain who dreamed of horizons far beyond the English Channel. More than anything, Raleigh was a creature of immense ambition, a man who understood that in the glittering, dangerous world of the Elizabethan court, you either rose to dazzling heights or you faded into obscurity. And Walter Raleigh had no intention of fading. His power stemmed from one critical source. He was the Queen's favorite. He had captured Elizabeth's attention with a potent combination of intellect, charm, and audacious flattery. Legends tell of him laying his own expensive cloak over a puddle so his queen would not soil her shoes. A gesture, whether true or not, that perfectly encapsulates his public persona. He moved through the court like a peacock, but behind the velvet and pearls was a calculating and relentless mind. He saw the world as a chessboard and knew that the greatest prizes lay across the ocean, while other courtiers vied for influence within the confines of the palace. Raleigh's gaze was fixed on the vast, unclaimed lands of North America. He became the chief evangelist for the cause of colonization. In the Queen's private chambers and in the halls of power, he argued his case with a poet's passion and a strategist's logic. He painted pictures with his words, speaking of a land where the soil was rich beyond measure, where the forests held timber enough to build 1,000 royal navies, and where gold might be found to rival the treasures of Spain. He spoke of national pride, of planting the flag of St. George on a new continent. But he also spoke the language of power that Elizabeth understood so well. A settlement in this new land, he argued, would be a strategic outpost, a base from which English ships could harass and intercept the Spanish treasure fleets as they sailed home, crippling their economy and their war machine. As a masterstroke of flattery and political genius, he proposed to name this new territory Virginia, in honor of his benefactor, the Virgin Queen. By doing this, he was no longer just asking for permission for a private venture. He was inviting Elizabeth to attach her own name, her own legacy, to this grand enterprise. It was an offer she could not refuse. In 1584, Elizabeth granted Raleigh a royal charter, giving him 7 years to establish a permanent colony in the New World. It was not a promise of funds or ships from the crown, but it was something far more valuable. It was permission. It was the key that unlocked the door to America. With the Queen's blessing secured, Walter Raleigh's grand and ultimately tragic vision could finally be set in motion. With the Queen's charter in hand, Raleigh moved quickly. Elizabeth, fearing to lose her favorite courtier to the dangers of the Atlantic, forbade him from leading the expedition himself. So instead, he organized and financed a reconnaissance mission, a preliminary voyage to scout the vast territory granted to him. In April of 1584, 2 small, well-supplied ships, commanded by Captains Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, slipped out of Plymouth Harbor and pointed their bows toward the setting sun. Their mission was not to colonize, but simply to see, to explore the coastline, to make contact with the native inhabitants, and to return with a report on whether Raleigh's dream was a fantasy or a tangible possibility after more than 2 months at sea. They made landfall in early July, likely near what is now the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The first impressions recorded by Arthur Barlow read like a dispatch from paradise. He wrote of an overwhelming fragrance that drifted out to meet their ships, so sweet and so strong a smell, as if we had been in the midst of some delicate garden. When they went ashore, they found a land of breathtaking abundance. Grapevines hung so thickly from the trees that the surf sometimes washed over. Their clusters, towering cedars, oaks, and pines formed a dense, cathedral-like forest, teeming with wildlife. for men accustomed to the managed fields and crowded cities of England. This was a world untouched, a pristine wilderness overflowing with life. Within a few days, they made their first contact. A small canoe with 3 native men approached there, ships without fear. One of them was brought aboard and gifted a hat and a shirt, and he departed to his village, returning shortly with a boat loaded with fish to give to the English in thanks. This peaceful exchange set the tone for the entire visit. The English was soon greeted by Granganimio, the brother of the local chief, Wingina. The Secretan people, as they were known, were described by Barlow as gentle, loving, and faithful. The English traded their tin dishes and copper kettles for valuable deerskins, and a cautious but genuine friendship began to form. It was a golden moment of mutual curiosity and respect, an idyllic first chapter in a story that would soon turn dark. Before leaving, the captains made a fateful decision. They persuaded 2 young native men to accompany them on the return voyage. To England, Manteo from the nearby island of CROATOAN, and Wanchese from Roanoke itself. For the English, these men were the ultimate prize. They were living proof of the New World's inhabitants, invaluable sources of intelligence about the land and its people, and a powerful tool to generate excitement and investment back home. Upon their arrival in London, they were a sensation. The sight of these 2 men from an entirely different world, walking the streets of the capital, ignited the imagination of the public and the court. Raleigh's expedition was declared a resounding success. The land was a paradise, the natives were friendly, and the potential seemed limitless. The report delivered to the Queen was so glowing that the first crucial steps were taken to fund a proper colony, a military settlement to secure England's foothold in Virginia. The dream was now ready to become a reality. The glowing reports from Armadas and Barlow ignited a firestorm of excitement in London. Raleigh's venture was no longer a speculative dream. It was a tangible reality, a golden opportunity. Investors lined up, and a second, far more ambitious expedition was quickly assembled. This was to be the real thing. A full-fledged colony. In the spring of 1585, a fleet of 7 ships carrying over 500 men, 100 of whom would remain as colonists, departed from England. But this was not a fleet of hopeful families seeking a new life. This was a military operation, and its leaders were not diplomats, but men of war. The expedition was commanded by Sir Richard Grenville, a cousin of Raleigh's, known for his aristocratic pride and a notoriously fiery temper. He was a man of the sea, more interested in chasing Spanish prize ships than in the tedious work of building a community. The man appointed to be the governor of the colony itself was Ralph Lane, a professional soldier, a hardened veteran of England's brutal and bloody campaigns in Ireland. Lane's experience there had taught him to see any non-English population not as potential partners, but as obstacles to be subdued. He was a man who understood order, discipline, and the application of force. The pairing of these 2 proud, unyielding men at the head of the enterprise was a sign of its intent. This mission was not about coexistence, it was about conquest. The colonists themselves were a reflection of this. They were soldiers, sailors, and specialists, metallurgists to assay or for gold, and artisans to build fortifications. Their purpose was clear: establish a military foothold, build a fort to serve as a base for privateering raids against the Spanish, and systematically explore the land for immediate sources of wealth. The dream of a new society had been replaced by the more urgent and practical goal of a profitable military outpost. But from the very beginning, the grand endeavor was plagued by misfortune. The voyage across the Atlantic was punishing. A severe storm off the coast of Portugal scattered the fleet, and one of the ships, along with its entire crew and vital supplies, was lost. When the remaining ships finally regrouped and approached the coast of Virginia, disaster struck again. Grenville's flagship, the Tiger, ran aground on the treacherous, sifting sandbars of the Outer Banks. Seawater flooded the hold, ruining a vast portion of their food supplies, their seeds for planting, and, most critically, their gunpowder. Before a single man had even set foot on Roanoke Island with the intent to stay, the colony was already crippled. The pristine paradise that had been described with such wonder a year earlier was now revealing a much harsher and more dangerous side. The mission had begun with a crippling blow, a dark omen for the difficult year that lay ahead. Despite the disastrous beginning, the English set to work with military efficiency. Under Ralph Lane's stern direction, the men began constructing an earthen fort, a star-shaped structure designed to withstand a European-style assault, a clear sign of their military mindset. While the soldiers labored in the humid summer heat, Sir Richard Grenville took an exploratory party to probe the surrounding mainland, venturing into the territories of the Algonquian-speaking tribes. These were not missions of friendship. They were armed intelligence-gathering operations, mapping the rivers and estuaries, and taking note of the native villages and their resources. It was during one of these expeditions that the fragile peace was irrevocably shattered. While visiting the village of Aquascogok, a small silver cup went missing from the English party. The accusation was immediate. It had been stolen. A diplomatic incident, perhaps, but one that could have been resolved with patience. Grenville, however, was not a patient man, steeped in the brutal tactics of European warfare. He chose to respond not with negotiation, but with overwhelming and terrifying force. He returned to the village and demanded the cup's return. When it was not immediately produced, he ordered his men to burn the entire village to the ground. They set fire to the longhouses, and, most cruelly, they torched the surrounding cornfields, destroying the tribe's entire food supply just before the harvest. This single act of disproportionate violence was a catastrophe. The news spread like wildfire through the network of coastal tribes. The English were not guests. They were not partners. They were a dangerous and unpredictable force that would destroy a village's entire livelihood over a piece of metal. The goodwill and curiosity that had greeted the first English visitors a year ago evaporated, replaced by a deep and justified fear, which quickly hardened into a desire for revenge. Having sown the seeds of hatred and conflict, Sir Richard Grenville decided his work was done. In late August 1585, he sailed back to England to deliver his report to Rowley, leaving Ralph Lane and his garrison of 107 men behind. He promised to return the following spring with fresh supplies and reinforcements as the sails of Grenville's fleet vanished over the horizon. The reality of their situation must have dawned on Lane's men. They were isolated thousands of miles from home, with damaged supplies, in a land whose people they had just violently alienated. The winter that followed was one of hardship and growing desperation. The food they had brought was dwindling rapidly. Their expeditions in search of gold and the fabled passage to the Pacific Ocean yielded nothing but frustration, as their own. Provisions ran out. They became increasingly, and ironically, dependent on the very people they had terrorized. They needed the natives to sell them corn and fish to survive. The English, with all their guns and armor, found themselves in a position of weakness beggars in a land they had intended to conquer. As the brutal winter gave way to a tense and hungry spring, the leadership of the native resistance fell to one man, Wingjuna, the very same chief whose brother had so graciously welcomed the English a year before. He had watched the newcomers, closely seen their arrogance, their insatiable demands for food, and their violent nature. Realizing they were a threat to his people's very existence, he moved his capital from Roanoke Island to the mainland village of Desamunkapuk and began to organize a coalition of tribes. In a symbolic act of defiance, he even changed his name to Pemisapon. His strategy was one of patient, creeping strangulation. He forbade his people from trading with the English and quietly urged other villagers to do the same, hoping to starve the garrison into submission before launching a coordinated final assault inside Fort Raleigh. Governor Lane saw the net tightening round him. The flow of food from the native villagers slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. His men were gaunt, their discipline fraying. He heard whispers, carried by natives still friendly to the English cause, of Pemisopon's plan to attack Lane. The hardened soldier knew that to wait was to die. On the 1st of June, 1586, he decided to seize the initiative with a preemptive and utterly ruthless strike. Under the pretense of a peaceful meeting, Lane and a group of his best soldiers rode to Desamunkapuk. As they stood before Pemisopon and his senior advisors, Lane gave a prearranged signal, the cry, "Christ our victory." In an instant, the English opened fire. The quiet meeting erupted into a scene of chaos and slaughter. Pemisopon was struck by a bullet but, badly wounded, managed to flee into the nearby woods. He was pursued by one of Lane's lieutenants, who returned to the shore not with a prisoner, but with the chief's severed head. Lane had won. He had decapitated the native leadership and broken the conspiracy against him. But it was a hollow, desperate victory. In killing Pemisopon, he had extinguished the last possibility of peaceful coexistence. The colony was now completely isolated, surrounded by enraged tribes, with starvation a mathematical certainty. The supply ships from Grenville, promised for April, were nowhere to be seen. All hope was lost. Then a miracle appeared. A week later, a massive fleet of over 20 ships appeared on the horizon. It was not Grenville. It was the fleet of Sir Francis Drake, England's most famous and feared privateer, returning home after a hugely successful campaign of raiding Spanish cities in the Caribbean. Drake agreed to help, offering Lane a ship, fresh supplies, and replacement men. But as they began the transfer, a furious storm, likely a hurricane, descended upon the Outer Banks, battering the coast for 3 days and nearly sinking Drake's ships. For Lane's exhausted and demoralized men, this was the final sign. They saw it as the wrath of God himself, condemning their enterprise. They refused to stay a moment longer. They crowded onto Drake's ships and, in June of 1586, abandoned Roanoke Island for good. The first English colony in America had lasted less than a year. It ended not with a bang, but with a retreat, leaving behind an empty fort, a legacy of violence, and the simmering hatred of a people whose welcome had been met with fire and steel. When Ralph Lane and his men returned to England in 1586, they brought with them stories of hardship and violence, but also treasures of a different kind. They introduced tobacco to the English court, a strange and exotic leaf that would one day shape the fortunes of a nation. They also brought back detailed maps and knowledge of the land, a hard-won intelligence that was not lost on their patron, Sir Walter Raleigh. The first colony had been a humiliating and expensive failure, But Raleigh's ambition was not so easily extinguished. He studied the failure, analyzed its causes, and came to a revolutionary conclusion. The military model had been wrong from the start. A garrison of soldiers, dependent on supplies from home and trade with the natives, could never be self-sufficient. They were occupiers, not settlers. Raleigh's new vision was for a true colony, a civilian settlement he would call the City of Raleigh. This would not be a fort, but a town. It would be populated not by soldiers seeking gold, but by families seeking a new life. He would offer them land of their own, a powerful incentive for them to work the soil, build permanent homes, and invest their own sweat and labor into the success of the venture. This was not to be a conquest, but a transplantation of English society onto American soil. The man Raleigh chose to lead this audacious, new endeavor was a world away from the hardened soldier, Ralph Lane. His name was John White. White was not a military man. He was an artist and a cartographer. His tools were the paintbrush and the pen, not the sword and the musket. Crucially, he was also a veteran of the 1585 expedition. He had walked the shores of Roanoke, explored its forests, and, most importantly, he had observed its people. His detailed watercolor paintings of the Algonquian people and their villages survive to this day, providing us with our only contemporary visual record of their way of life. He was a man who saw the world with an artist's eye for detail, not a soldier's eye for threats. But this time, John White was not just an observer. He was to be the governor, and his commitment was deeply, profoundly personal. Among the colonists sailing with him were his own daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare, and Eleanor was pregnant. For John White, this journey was not about national glory or financial gain. It was about building a safe new world for his own grandchild. This personal stake was reflected in the colonists themselves. Of the 117 people who set sail, 17 were women and 9 were children. They were carpenters, bricklayers, and farmers. Families who were leaving behind the rigid class structure of England for the promise of land and opportunity. This was a community, a seed of a new society, filled with a fragile but determined hope, sailing toward a shore that had already proven to be a graveyard for English dreams. The plan, conceived by Raleigh and entrusted to John White, was explicit and clear. The new colony was not to be established at Roanoke. The memory of Lane's failed expedition, the legacy of bloodshed, and the resulting hostility of the local tribes had poisoned that location. The intended destination was 100 miles to the north, in the deep, sheltered waters of the Chesapeake Bay. Its shores were said to be more fertile, its harbors more suitable for large ships, and, most importantly, it offered a chance for a fresh start with native peoples who had not yet been wronged by English guns. The stop at Roanoke was intended to be a brief one, for the sole purpose of checking on a small holding party that was supposed to have been left there by Sir Richard Grenville the previous year. The journey across the Atlantic in the summer of 1587 was arduous but largely uneventful, but a tension was simmering just below the surface. This tension centered on one man, Simon Fernandes, the chief pilot of the small fleet. Fernandes was a Portuguese navigator of immense skill and experience, perhaps the most knowledgeable pilot of the American coast in all of England. But he was also a privateer, a man whose primary motivation was the pursuit of Spanish prize ships, not the patient, unprofitable work of colonization. He was known for his arrogance and his difficult temperament, and his goals were not necessarily aligned with those of Governor White and his families. In late July, the ships anchored off the Outer Banks, John White and a small party went ashore at Roanoke to search for the holding party, only to find no trace of them. After this grim discovery, White fully intended to reboard and continue north to the Chesapeake as planned. It was then that Simon Fernandez made his move. He flatly refused to go any further. He argued that the summer was far spent, and he would not risk his ships and crew searching for a new settlement site up the coast. He declared his intention to sail south for the Caribbean to hunt for Spanish ships before the hurricane season set in, and he ordered the colonists and all of their belongings to be put ashore right there at Roanoke. John White was horrified. As governor of the colony, he was the leader of the people, but at sea, the pilot's authority over the ships was absolute. He argued, he protested, but he was powerless. Fernandez would not be moved. And so, in a moment of profound betrayal, the 117 colonists were not led to their promised land, but were effectively marooned at the one location they were supposed to avoid. Imagine the scene: men, women, and children, including White's own pregnant daughter, being ferried to a shore haunted by failure, their supplies dumped unceremoniously on the sand, all while the man responsible prepared to sail away in search of treasure. Their new beginning was starting not with hope, but on a foundation of broken promises and in the long, dark shadow of a violent past. Forced ashore, the colonists had no choice but to make the best of their desperate situation. They trudged to the north end of the island, to the site of Lane's abandoned settlement. The fort was overgrown, and the cottages were in disrepair. But they were serviceable. With a grim sense of determination, they set to work, clearing the weeds and repairing the thatched roofs, trying to breathe life back into a place that was already a monument to failure. Their grand city of Raleigh was, for now, nothing more than a handful of patched-up huts huddled behind a decaying earthen wall. Their only real comfort came from their native guide, Mateo. He journeyed to his home on the island of CROATOAN and returned with news that his people were willing to help the colonists. A vital link of friendship in a land that was otherwise hostile, but the peace was fragile, and the past was not finished with them. The local tribes, the people of Roanoke and Desmumkipak, remembered Ralph Lane's treachery and the beheading of their chief Pemisopan. Their desire for vengeance had not faded. In late July, a colonist named George Howe was crabbing alone in a sound away from the main settlement. He was ambushed. His body was found later, lying in the reeds, pierced by 16 arrows. The attack was a brutal and unambiguous message. The war started by Lane's men was not over. Faced with rising panic among his people, John White felt compelled to act. He authorized a retaliatory strike. Guided by Mateo, the English launched a surprise night attack on Desmumkipak, the village where they believed Howe's killers were hiding. They crept towards the village fires, saw silhouettes of people around them, and opened fire. But as they rushed into the camp, the cries of pain were not those of their enemies. In the dark, they had made a catastrophic mistake. The Roanoke warriors had long since fled the village. The people they had just attacked were friendly CROATOANs, Mateo's own kin, who had traveled to the abandoned village to gather corn from the overgrown fields. Though Mateo managed to smooth over the tragic blunder, the trust between the English and their only allies was deeply shaken. Yet, in the midst of this escalating dread, a moment of profound and singular hope arrived. On the 18th of August, 1587, John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Virginia. She was the first English child ever born in the New World, a symbol of innocence and of the future they were all fighting for. For her grandfather, Governor John White, the joy of her birth must have been mingled with a terrible, chilling fear. He had brought his family here to build a new life, but had instead led them into a repaired ruin. Surrounded by enemies, their alliances fractured. The birth of his granddaughter gave the colony a reason to live, but it also gave them so much more to lose. The quiet joy that followed the birth of Virginia Dare was short-lived, for the colonists could not ignore the turning of the calendar. It was now late August. The Atlantic winds were beginning to carry a cooler edge, and the days were growing shorter. The ships that had brought them to this shore, and their contentious pilot Simon Fernandez, were long gone. A chilling realization began to settle over the small community as they took stock of their supplies. The barrels of flour, the salted meat, the stores of peas and grain, all seemed to shrink before their eyes. They laid everything out and did the grim arithmetic. It was not enough. They did not have what they needed to survive the coming winter. Their predicament was a direct result of being marooned at Roanoke. The original plan to settle in the Chesapeake Bay had accounted for a different climate, different resources, and, most importantly, different native relations. Here, on this hostile island, with little chance of peaceful trade for food, and with no time to plant and harvest a significant crop of their own, they were facing a slow and certain starvation. Panic began to set in. In a series of urgent and desperate meetings, the colonists came to a single, unavoidable conclusion. One of them had to go back. Someone had to return to England immediately, to inform Sir Walter Raleigh of their disastrous landing and to beg him to send a relief expedition with supplies as soon as humanly possible. But no one wanted to make the journey. To leave was to risk the treacherous Atlantic crossing, but it was also to risk being labeled a deserter, a coward who had abandoned his fellows in their time of need. After days of debate, the entire colony came to a unanimous decision. There was only one person they could trust with this sacred mission. There was only one person whose influence with Raleigh was strong enough to guarantee a response, and whose personal stake was so profound that his return was an absolute certainty. They chose their governor, John White. He was horrified by the request. White's own writings tell us that he refused immediately and vehemently. He argued that if he left, his enemies in England would slander his name, accusing him of abandoning his colony to its fate while he returned to the comforts of home. He protested that he had come to build a life with them, to share in their struggles, and that he would rather stay and face whatever came, to live or die alongside his family and his people. He did not want to leave his daughter, Eleanor, and he certainly did not want to leave his newborn granddaughter, Virginia, not even for a day. But the colonists were insistent. Their survival, they argued, depended not on his presence, but on his absence. He was their only hope. John White's refusal, born of honor and love for his family, was met with an equal measure of desperate persistence. The colonists did not relent. Seeing that mere verbal pleas were not enough, they presented him with a formal petition in writing. It was a remarkable document, a testament to their unity and their fear. In it, they swore to protect his reputation, to bear witness to all of England that their governor had not fled his post, but had been forced to leave by the earnest entreaties of the colonists themselves. They were, in effect, giving him a direct order, absolving him of the dishonor he so greatly feared. This placed the entire weight of their survival squarely upon his shoulders. Trapped between his duty as a governor and his love as a father, John White finally, and with a heavy heart, agreed to go. Before his departure, a crucial protocol was established. a simple but vital method of communication in case the worst should happen. If the colonists were forced to abandon the settlement at Roanoke, they were to carve the name of their destination onto a conspicuous tree or post. And they added one more critical detail. If they had been forced to leave in distress, if they had been driven out by violence or famine, they were to carve a Maltese cross above the name of their new location. The absence of a cross would therefore be a signal in itself. It would mean that they had left of their own free will in an orderly and unhurried fashion. With this grim agreement in place, all that was left were the goodbyes. On August 27, 1587, John White prepared to leave. We can only imagine the sorrow of that day on the lonely shore of Roanoke. He said farewell to the men and women who had entrusted their lives to him, looking into their anxious faces and giving them his solemn promise that he would return. But his most difficult farewell was to his own family. He embraced his daughter, Eleanor, a young mother in a strange and dangerous land, and he held his granddaughter, Virginia, for what he did not know would be the last time. She was only 9 days old. He was leaving behind a piece of his own soul, a tiny, helpless infant whose future now depended entirely on the speed of his journey and the mercy of the sea. As his small boat pulled away from the island, he watched the crowd of 117 settlers grow smaller and smaller until they were just figures on the sand. Then, as the ship caught the wind, the island itself began to recede, a green and lonely outpost on the edge of a vast, indifferent ocean. John White was sailing east, back toward civilization and help, but his heart, his family, and all his hopes remained behind him on that silent, vulnerable shore. He had promised to be back by the spring. It was a promise made with every fiber of his being, a promise that fate, war, and the machinations of kings would make impossible to keep. John White's journey back to England was a brutal ordeal. The small ship he sailed on was battered by a foul and tempestuous autumn sea. At one point, they were attacked by a hostile French vessel, and White himself was wounded in the fighting. After weeks of struggle, he finally landed in England in early November 1587. Exhausted and injured, but driven by the singular purpose of his mission. He went immediately to Sir Walter Raleigh, relayed the story of their plight at Roanoke, and impressed upon him the desperate urgency of sending aid. Raleigh, true to his commitment, was sympathetic and immediately began organizing a relief fleet. For a brief moment, it seemed that White's harrowing journey had been a success. Help was on its way. But John White had returned to an England that was holding its breath, a nation bracing for an invasion. From the south, a storm of steel and holy fury was gathering. King Philip II of Spain, after years of tolerating English privateering and Protestant defiance, had finally unleashed his full might. He was assembling the Great Armada, the largest naval fleet in human history, with one goal: to sail to England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and extinguish the flame of English Protestantism forever. The very survival of the nation was at stake. In the face of this existential threat, Queen Elizabeth and her council took an extreme but necessary measure. They issued a royal decree, a general stay of shipping. Every seaworthy vessel, every able-bodied captain and sailor in the entire country, was to be pressed into the service of the Royal Navy to defend the realm. No ship was permitted to leave an English port for any private voyage, whether for trade, exploration, or colonization. In a heartbeat, John White's world collapsed. The small fleet that Raleigh had been preparing for the relief of Roanoke was commandeered for the war effort. The ships were armed with cannons and sent to join the English fleet gathering at Plymouth. John White was trapped. He petitioned, he pleaded, he argued with officials at court, but his desperate pleas for a small colony of 100 people an ocean away were drowned out by the national cry for arms. The fate of Roanoke was an insignificant detail in a grand struggle of empires. Spring of 1588 arrived, the season when he had promised his family he would return. But instead of sailing west towards his daughter and granddaughter, White could only stand on the English coast and watch as Sir Francis Drake and the English Navy prepared for the impending battle. He was a governor with no way to reach his people, a grandfather powerless to save his family. And across the Atlantic, on the silent shores of Roanoke, the colonists would have been scanning the eastern horizon. Day after day, week after week, watching for sails that were never going to appear. Their lifeline had been severed, and they were utterly alone. 3 years. For a man waiting to return to his family, it was an eternity. The great Spanish Armada had come and gone in the summer of 1588. England had celebrated a glorious nation-saving victory, but for John White, the triumph was a bitter one. The war, and its aftermath, had consumed all of England's resources and attention. Sir Walter Raleigh's own fortunes had shifted, and his focus was drawn to other ventures. The small colony at Roanoke, once a priority, had become a fading memory to everyone except the one man who could not forget. John White spent those 3 years in a state of tormented limbo, a governor in exile. He lobbied at court, he pleaded with merchants, he petitioned any ship captain who would listen. A man haunted by a promise he had been forced to break. Finally, in 1590, a desperate opportunity arose. He could not secure a dedicated relief mission, so he was forced to make a devil's bargain. He arranged passage for himself on a privateering expedition bound for the West Indies. The captains of the ships, whose main business was to plunder Spanish settlements and seize treasure ships, reluctantly agreed to stop at Roanoke on their journey home to drop him off. It was a perilous and deeply compromised arrangement. White's mission of rescue was now just a side errand, a detour on a voyage of greed and violence. The ships departed England in March of 1590. For John White, the journey must have been agonizing. Instead of sailing directly for Virginia, the fleet spent months cruising the warm, turquoise waters of the Caribbean, hunting for their prey. White, the artist and grandfather, was forced to be a passenger on a vessel of hardened sea raiders. He had to wait, his anxiety mounting with each passing day, while his companions engaged in naval battles and sacked Spanish outposts. He was so close, geographically, to his family, yet trapped in a world of maritime conflict, his own urgent quest subject to the whims and profits of others. Every day of delay was another day his colonists were left to fend for themselves. Finally, as the summer wore on, the privateers, having filled their holds with enough plunder, agreed to honor their promise. In early August, they turned their ships northward, leaving the Caribbean behind and setting a course for the Outer Banks. It was now August of 1590, 3 full years since John White had watched Roanoke Island disappear over the horizon. As the familiar coastline of Virginia finally came into view, a mix of hope and a profound, chilling dread must have filled his heart. The years of waiting were over. He was about to get his answer. On the evening of August 17th, 1590, John White stood on the deck of a ship anchored off Roanoke, peering into the twilight. By a strange and poignant coincidence, the next day would have been his granddaughter Virginia's 3rd birthday. As darkness fell over the island, his heart must have leaped in his chest. For there, Through the gloom, he saw it, the unmistakable flicker of a large fire on the northern shore, the very spot where he had left his colony. Hope, after 3 long years of despair, surged through him. It had to be them. It had to be. A signal fire, a welcome beacon lit by his people. From the ships, they sounded a trumpet blast across the dark water, its brassy notes a clear announcement of their arrival. After the trumpet, the sailors began to sing familiar English folk songs and anthems. Calls of home sent out into the American wilderness. They listened, straining their ears for any reply, for any answering shout or song from the shore. But the only sound that came back to them was the mournful roar of the surf breaking on the sandbars. The silence that answered them was heavier and more absolute than any storm. The hopeful fire now seemed ominous, its meaning uncertain. They were forced to wait for the morning light to attempt a landing. The sea around the Outer Banks is notoriously treacherous, and the weather had turned foul. As they tried to row ashore the next day, the danger of the place became terrifyingly real. A sudden squall capsized one of the landing boats in the violent surf. Despite the desperate rescue efforts of their comrades, the ship's captain and 6 of his best sailors were drowned. The search for the lost colony had begun with a funeral. The mood of the privateer crew turned mutinous and grim. They had lost more men in a few minutes trying to land at Roanoke than in weeks of fighting the Spanish. They wanted nothing more than to leave this cursed place behind, now racing against the anger of his companions and the threatening weather. John White and a small party finally made it to shore. They stepped onto the sand of Roanoke Island, a place that had haunted White's dreams for 3 years. But there was no one there to greet them. The beach was empty. The path leading towards the settlement was overgrown and eerily silent, disturbed only by the sound of the wind whispering through the tall pines. As they began to walk inland, their hearts pounding with a terrible mixture of hope and fear, they saw footprints in the sand, but they were fresh, and there was no way to know if they belonged to an Englishman or a native. Every step towards the place where the houses once stood deepened the suspense, drawing them closer to an answer they now dreaded to find. As John White and his search party finally emerged into the clearing where the settlement had stood, they were met with a profound surprise. The small cluster of cottages and the low fence he had left behind were gone. In their place stood a formidable defensive structure, a high palisade made of a solid wall of tree trunks, creating a proper fort. It was clear that at some point after his departure, the colonists had become seriously concerned for their safety. As they neared this new fortress, White's eyes caught something on a tree at the edge of the clearing. Carved into the bark were 3 letters, CRO. Finding an entrance in the palisade, they stepped inside, and they were met with a scene of absolute, yet orderly, desolation. The houses that had once stood there were gone, but they had not been burned or torn apart in a struggle. They had been carefully dismantled, plank by plank, as if a whole community had packed up and moved away. The ground was overgrown with weeds and grass, and the entire enclosure was silent, empty. There were no bones, no bodies, no signs of any fight. It was a ghost town, but a ghost town that had been vacated peacefully by its inhabitants. Then White saw it. On a large post near the main entrance, carved in clear, bold Roman letters, was a single word, CROATOAN. He stared at the carving, and the weight of 3 years of fearful uncertainty lifted from his shoulders. A wave of profound relief washed over him. This was it. This was the signal he had been desperately searching for. CROATOAN was the name of the island to the south. the home of their trusted ally Manteo and his people. This was the colonists' message to him, telling him where they had gone, and then he searched for the second part of the signal, the sign of distress. He scanned the post, the surrounding trees, looking for the shape of a Maltese cross. There was none. The absence of the cross was just as significant as the presence of the word. It meant, according to their prearranged code, that his family and his colonists had not fled in panic or been driven out by an enemy. They had moved willingly, in an organized fashion, to a place of safety. In his own journal, White wrote that he was greatly joyed and much comforted by this discovery. The mystery, it seemed, was solved. His family was alive. The colonists were safe. All he had to do now was sail the 50 miles south to CROATOAN Island and reunite with them. As John White and his men rowed back towards their ship, the grim mood of the day was, for the governor, momentarily lifted. He clutched his knowledge like a treasure. He had an answer, CROATOAN. The word was a map, a destination, a promise of reunion. The 50-mile journey south was a trifle, a few hours of sailing that would end 3 years of agonizing uncertainty. He could already picture it. The joyful faces of the colonists, the embrace of his daughter Eleanor, and the sight of his granddaughter Virginia. Now a walking, talking 3-year-old whom he had only ever known as a tiny infant. The despair that had been his constant companion for so long was replaced by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate singular focus. But as they struggled through the churning sea, the wind began to howl with a new and terrifying ferocity. The sky, which had been threatening all day, turned a bruised and violent shade of grey. The storm they had feared was now upon them with its full power. By the time they were hauled back aboard the main ship, the vessel was being tossed violently on massive waves, its timbers groaning in protest. When White, full of renewed purpose, went to the captain and explained his discovery, demanding they sail for CROATOAN at once, he was met with a stony refusal. The captain had already lost 7 men to this cursed coast. He would not risk his ship and the lives of his entire crew for a clue carved on a post, as if to punctuate the captain's decision. The storm delivered a final, decisive blow. With a great groaning crack that was heard even over the roar of the wind, the ship's primary anchor cable snapped. The anchor, their only means of safely holding their position in the storm, was lost to the sea. That was the end of all debate. The ship was now untethered and at the mercy of the wind and waves, in one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world. An area that would one day be known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. The captain gave the order. They would make for the open sea immediately and set a course for England. There would be no trip to CROATOAN. We can only imagine the utter devastation that crushed John White in that moment. He was so close. From the deck of the ship, he could likely see the shores of CROATOAN Island in the distance. He had the answer. He knew where his family was, but he was being carried away from them by a storm of both water and human will. He would have pleaded, argued, perhaps even offered his own life, but it was useless. He was a passenger, not a commander. The ship turned its bow east, away from the New World, away from his family, away from his granddaughter Virginia. John White never set foot in America again. He would die in England years later, never knowing for certain the fate of the daughter and granddaughter he was forced to leave behind. The ships sailed away, and a profound and final silence fell over the coast of Virginia, leaving the colonists, wherever they were, truly and finally lost to the world they had left behind. With the departure of John White, the story of the Roanoke colony fractures. It ceases to be a single, linear narrative and instead becomes a mosaic of clues, rumors, archaeological findings, and persistent, haunting local legends. Sir Walter Raleigh, whose fortunes and favor at court were beginning to wane, did sponsor several more expeditions that were ordered to stop at the Outer Banks. But they were mostly privateering or trading ventures whose captains had little real interest in conducting a thorough search. One expedition in 1602 sailed within sight of the islands, but, citing bad weather, never even attempted to land. The official search for the lost colony had effectively ended. The 117 men, women, and children were left to their fate, their existence fading into the background noise of a growing empire. For 17 years, a silence descended. Then, in 1607, a new English settlement finally took root on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. It was called Jamestown, and it was from the settlers of Jamestown that the first faint echoes of the lost colonists were heard. The famous captain, John Smith, the leader of the Jamestown colony, was a meticulous chronicler of his interactions with the native tribes. In his journals, he wrote of being told stories by the great and powerful Chief Roanoke, whom the English called Powhatan. Powhatan spoke of men and women dressed like the English, living in settlements to the south, beyond the borders of his vast confederacy. The stories were vague, but tantalizing. They suggested that the colonists, or at least their descendants, had survived and established themselves somewhere inland. Powhatan also offered a more chilling account. He confessed to John Smith that he himself had orchestrated attacks on these southern settlements. He claimed that he had been urged to do so by his priests, who had foretold that a nation would arise from the Chesapeake Bay to threaten his own. Seeing the English at Jamestown as the fulfillment of this prophecy, he claimed to have eliminated the earlier group of English survivors to prevent them from joining forces with the new arrivals. He even produced several items for Smith as proof of his claims: a musket barrel, a brass mortar, and pieces of iron that could only have come from the Roanoke colonists. Was this a truthful confession or a boastful threat designed to intimidate the new Jamestown settlers? It was impossible to know for sure, but it was the first piece of evidence suggesting a violent end for some, if not all, of the colonists. Other Jamestown settlers heard similar tales. An exploring party sailing south from Jamestown reported hearing from natives that there was a town called Okanahonan, where the houses were 2 stories high with stone walls, and whose people apparelled like us and used brass. Another search party, venturing into the territory of the Roanoke tribe, was shown copper ingots and told they had been sourced from a place called Pekaraherrick, where the houses be built with stone walls and 1 story high, so they may hunt deer and kill them on the said houses. Throughout the early years of the 17th century, these whispers continued, painting a fragmented picture of survival, assimilation, and conflict. The colonists seemed to have dissolved into the complex tapestry of native life, leaving behind only these faint, almost mythical, stories of pale-skinned people living in strange houses, just beyond the reach of English explorers. The single, solid clue of CROATOAN had now splintered into a dozen different rumors, each pointing to a different possible fate. Of all the whispers and rumors that emerged from the forests of the New World, none was more powerful or more persistent than the single word carved on that post, CROATOAN. This was not a rumor, it was a message. It was a clear declaration of intent left by the colonists themselves. John White, the man who knew their plans and their code, never for a moment believed they had been massacred at Roanoke. He died believing his family and his colony had relocated to CROATOAN Island, which is now known as Hatteras Island. and had found sanctuary with the people of their trusted ally, Manteo. For centuries, this has remained the most compelling and hopeful of all the theories. It is a theory not of a lost colony, but of a transformed one. The evidence for this theory is woven into the very fabric of the island's history. The people of CROATOAN, led by Manteo, had been the most consistent and reliable friends the English had. Manteo himself had travelled to England, been baptized into the Christian faith, and been named Lord of Roanoke and Deus Munkapak by the English, a symbolic gesture that nonetheless cemented his alliance with them. It is perfectly logical that if the colonists felt threatened at Roanoke, their first and most obvious choice would be to seek refuge with these allies, just 50 miles to the south. The move would have been a sensible and planned migration, not a panicked flight, which would explain the carefully dismantled houses and the absence of a distress signal. For centuries, the story seemed to end there. But in the 1880s, a startling new chapter emerged. A group of people living in Robeson County, North Carolina, deep inland, petitioned the state legislature to be officially recognized as a distinct Native American tribe. They called themselves the Lumbee, and their oral tradition, passed down through countless generations, contained a remarkable claim. They said that their ancestors were the survivors of the Roanoke colony, who had intermarried with the CROATOAN people and had eventually migrated away from the coast, deeper into the mainland swamps and forests. The physical and cultural evidence they presented was tantalizing. For generations, many Lumbee families carried English surnames that were identical to those on the list of the 117 lost colonists. Dare Cooper, Harvey, Sampson. Even more striking was their appearance. Early observers frequently described them as having European features, grey or blue eyes, and fair hair, traits that were uncommon among other Native American groups in the region. Their language, too, was a unique dialect of English, peppered with archaic words and speech patterns that some linguists believed could have origins in Elizabethan English. The story was so compelling that for a time, many believed the mystery was finally solved. The colony was not lost. Its bloodline simply flowed on, merged with that of their saviors, in the veins of the Lumbee people. Recent archaeological work and ongoing DNA studies continue to explore this profound and deeply personal connection, searching for a scientific confirmation of a story that has been told around Lumbee firesides for centuries. The CROATOAN theory suggests that the colonists survived not by conquering the New World, but by becoming part of it. And so, our journey ends not at a clear destination, but in a fog of possibilities. Perhaps the answer lies within the bloodlines of the Lumbee people, a story of survival and assimilation, where the colonists were not lost, but found, in a way they never could have imagined. Or perhaps the truth is far darker. Buried with unnamed bones beneath the soil of North Carolina, a tragedy of starvation, disease, or violence at the hands of a force we can never truly identify. The fate of those 117 souls remains one of the most haunting blank chapters in America's history book. A story that began with the ambition of an empire and ended with a single word carved into wood. CROATOAN, both a clue and a farewell. So, which theory do you find most compelling? A silent survival or a tragic end? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We always love to hear the insights of the Forbidden Lore community. If this exploration into America's oldest mystery has piqued your curiosity, please show your support with a like, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the forgotten pages of history. Thank you for joining Forbidden Lore. Always keep questioning, for the greatest stories often hide in the shadows.